Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my July wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the things that I read in the month of July. So July for me was Jane Austen July, which is a readathon I host every year along with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish and Claudia from Spencer's Library. So most of the things I read in July, though not all of them, are related to Jane Austen in some way. So I will start off with some classics and the Jane Austen books that I read in July. So our group read for Jane Austen July this year was Mansfield Park, which I reread. I didn't read this physical edition. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Frances Barber, which I've listened to several times and really enjoy. I had a great reread of Mansfield Park this year. Mansfield Park is a real favourite Jane Austen novel of mine. It's my second favourite after Pride and Prejudice, and I love it very much, and it's been quite a while since I last reread it, but I always find it such an interesting one to reread because I always spot new things and have new interpretations. The characters are so complicated, the situations are so messy, and I just really enjoy Mansfield Park every time I read it, and it was really lovely to read it this year for the group read, and to take part in lots of interesting discussions on the Discord server. I feel like a lot of people don't love Mansfield Park as much as Austen's other novels, so I always enjoy getting other people to try Mansfield Park again or to find new things in Mansfield Park. So yeah, very satisfying read overall. If you don't know what Mansfield Park is about, it is a story of Fanny Price, who is adopted by her wealthy relations. She leaves her family while still a child, goes to live with her cousins and aunt and uncle, and grows up sort of half part of this wealthy upper class family, but not sort of fully part of it, and it's about her life and her relationships, and it's just a really fantastic novel that I love very much indeed. Then I also reread Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Again, I didn't read this physical edition, I listened to the audiobook, and this time narrated by Rosamund Pike, which is a wonderful audiobook of Pride and Prejudice. I've listened to it many times, I love it very much, and I thoroughly enjoyed my reread of Pride and Prejudice. I reread Pride and Prejudice most years. It's one of my favourite novels ever. I have read it many times indeed, and every time I read it it's just a pleasure. I just always have such a joyous, fun reading experience of Pride and Prejudice. It's such a funny, witty, warm novel that I just know so well and love so much, and every time I reread it it's just lovely. So that was very nice. You probably do know a bit about Pride and Prejudice already, but it is the story of the Bennet family, mother and father and 5 daughters, specifically focusing on the elder 2, Elizabeth and Jane, and their romantic relationships. And I also reread one other thing by Jane Austen, which was Lady Susan, which again I listened to an audiobook. I listened to the Naxos audiobook that is narrated by several different people, and Lady Susan is an epistolary novella written in letters, and they have a different voice actor for every character, which works really well. So I would highly recommend that audiobook of Lady Susan. I really enjoyed my reread of Lady Susan. In general, it's a novella that I really like. I find it very funny, very witty, just very entertaining in every way, and it's been quite a while since I last read it, so it was really nice to reread it. I'd also never listened to it before an audiobook. I'd only read it physically, so that was a really nice experience as well. It is the story of a slightly older Jane Austen heroine, and also an anti-heroine more than a heroine, but Lady Susan is in her mid-30s. She has a grown-up daughter, and she is a widow, and she is a bit of a scandalous character who likes to flirt, and likes to manipulate those around her, and that makes an epistolary novella very fun, because Lady Susan is very two-faced and will say completely different things to completely different people, and it's just a wonderful novella that is very entertaining. So I highly recommend Lady Susan if you haven't read it. It's really worth your time. So those are the books by Jane Austen that I read in July, but then I did also read some other classics from Jane Austen's time, or from a little bit before when she was writing, from the late 18th century. So one thing that I read was the play Lovers' Vows by Elizabeth Inchbold. This is a really interesting play that I read specifically because Mansfield Park was the group read this year, and within Mansfield Park several of the characters put on some amateur dramatics, and the play that they are rehearsing is Lovers' Vows, which is a real play, and was a popular one in Jane Austen's time. Jane Austen probably assumed that people reading Mansfield Park would have heard of Lovers' Vows, and I have read Lovers' Vows before, but not for a few years, so I thought I would reread it, and I made a video talking about Mansfield Park and Lovers' Vows and all the sort of like connections and so on between them, and sort of why Lovers' Vows is a scandalous play for these young people to be performing in Mansfield Park. So I'll leave that video link down below. And I mostly reread Lovers' Vows sort of for that video, but I really enjoyed my reread of Lovers' Vows. I think it's a really interesting play. It's quite silly and melodramatic, but it also is quite subversive in quite a lot of ways, which I find really interesting. There's a lot of interesting like class and gender stuff going on in Lovers' Vows, and while it's a bit melodramatic and over the top, like, I don't know, I just find it quite compelling. So I recommend reading Lovers' Vows, especially if you've read Mansfield Park and are kind of interested to get more of an insight into the Mansfield theatricals. Then the other 18th century thing I read in July was A Sicilian Romance by Anne Radcliffe. This was the pick for the historical fiction book club that I run over on my Patreon, and this was an interesting read. This is my third Anne Radcliffe, and I feel like I'm probably not going to read that much more by her because I quite like her books, but I don't love them. They are quite melodramatic and sort of over the top and silly in a way that I think is really good fun, but also is only good fun for so long. And I feel like I probably don't have too much more to get out of her books, having read a few, I suppose. But I did find A Sicilian Romance really interesting. So it's from the late 18th century, but it's set in 16th century Sicily, and it is about the two daughters of a sort of tyrannical nobleman, and one of them wants to marry a young man who she's fallen in love with, but her father wants her to marry a duke. So there's all of the sort of tension there. Meanwhile, there is a wing of their house that may or may not be haunted, and it sort of has all of the tropes you would expect in an 18th century Gothic novel. And one of the reasons why Anne Radcliffe's work often feels very tropey is because she sort of began a lot of these tropes. This is from very early on in the history of the Gothic. And I think the way this book looks at gender power dynamics and sort of the lack of power that many young women had, both sort of at the time that the book is set, but also at the time the book was being published. I think all of that stuff is really, really interesting. But as I said, it is quite melodramatic and a bit over the top. I would say, having read a few books by Anne Radcliffe, I think this is a less interesting novel than The Mysteries of Udolpho. The Mysteries of Udolpho, I think, is more complex and more interesting. But I do think that A Sicilian Romance is very short and is quite a good like example of Anne Radcliffe's work. Like, I think if you read A Sicilian Romance, which is only like just under 200 pages, if you read A Sicilian Romance, you'll get a good taste for like whether you will like more things by Anne Radcliffe. So in that sense, it might be quite a good place to start with Anne Radcliffe, though I don't think it is as strong a novel as The Mystery of Udolpho, but it will take you a lot less time. So yeah, that's what I'd say about A Sicilian Romance. Then I read a whole bunch of Jane Austen retellings and other related things. So I read this. This is You Are Elizabeth Bennet, a choose-your-own Jane Austen adventure by Emma Campbell-Webster. This is a choose-your-own adventure novel that sort of begins with the plot of Pride and Prejudice and then goes into several different directions, some of which take you sort of effectively into other Jane Austen novels. I quite enjoyed this. I had good fun doing the Choose Your Own Adventure. I made a video about it. I'll leave that link down below. And it was a fun, entertaining experience. I do feel like there would have been ways to make this even more fun. Like, I feel like a lot of it is just, oh, if you take this decision, you basically step into Northanger Abbey or you step into Emma. And I feel like actually there would be ways of doing it within the world of Pride and Prejudice that would have been more interesting. Like, there are a few like decision points in Pride and Prejudice where, what if Elizabeth made a different decision? How differently would the book go? And I feel like that would have been more interesting for me personally, but I did find it a fun read, and it was definitely an entertaining way to spend an afternoon. Then I also read The Unlikely Pursuit of Mary Bennet by Lindsay MacLeod, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. I feel like I need to give some minor Pride and Prejudice spoilers to explain the premise of this book, so just be warned. But this book follows Charlotte Lucas after her marriage to Mr. Collins, after Mr. Collins has died, which doesn't happen in Pride and Prejudice, but happens at the beginning of this book. Charlotte Lucas is left a widow on her own, and she writes to her friend Elizabeth Bennet, asking Elizabeth to come and stay with her, but Elizabeth can't come. So instead, she sends her younger sister Mary to come and sort of keep Charlotte company in her grief. And Charlotte and Mary, you know, end up falling in love. This is a really fun romance novel that I really enjoyed, and I think the sort of two sort of plot strands, I guess, to this book. There is the love story element, the romance element, and then there is sort of Charlotte coming to understand herself better and coming to terms with her own sexuality and what that means at the point in time she lives in. Both were done very well, and the sort of coming of age, coming to understand yourself better plot, I just thought was so well done. So I really, really enjoyed this. And I believe that Linz McLeod's second book has Caroline Bingley as a main character, so I'm very intrigued to read that as well. Then talking of Mary Bennet, I also reread The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling which follows the character of Mary Bennet, Elizabeth's sister, during and after Pride and Prejudice, and sort of gives Mary a love story of her own. I first read this back in 2020, and then I reread it this year, just after Nick and I had finished watching the mini-series adaptation of The Other Bennet Sister, because we wanted to make a video about it, and I just wanted to refresh my memory of the novel and sort of what they had changed. So again, I'll leave that video link down below. But I quite enjoyed my reread. This is not my favourite Jane Austen retelling. I think it's a bit too long. And I think the pacing is not quite right for me personally. I feel like this book could do with less of the stuff that takes place during the course of Pride and Prejudice, because for me where it's strongest is Mary living her own life beyond Pride and Prejudice with new characters and all of that stuff. I think the sort of bits that take place during Pride and Prejudice work less well for me. And I think I've said this before several times on this channel, but I do feel like Janice Hadlow's interpretation of Mrs. Bennet and Charlotte Lucas differs quite strongly from my interpretation of those characters, so that is a bit of a jar for me. Overall, I think there are some really fun elements to this novel, and I think it's a really enjoyable novel, but I don't think it is a perfect Austen retelling for me. I read two murder mystery / crime Jane Austen retellings. So the first was The Rushworth Family Plot by Claudia Gray. This is the fourth book in a series. I have read the rest of the books in the series and I'm really enjoying them. I can't say too much about the overarching plot because that builds up between books. This is very much not one of those mystery series you can read out of order, I would say. I think you should definitely read it in order. But we basically are following Jonathan Darcy, the child of the Darcys, and Juliet Tilney, the child of some people from Northanger Abbey, as they come together to solve mysteries that relate to various people within Austen. In this novel, we're in London, and someone connected to the characters from Mansfield Park is killed. Everything goes on from there, and it's really engaging. The mystery was good, and I really enjoy the character relationships. I think Jonathan and Juliet's dynamic is really, really well done. I do feel that there are certain elements of the overarching plot that have been stretched out maybe like one book too long, and I'm kind of curious to see what happens in the next book and whether I still feel that. But overall, I really enjoy it. It's a very good, fun series. Then I also read this. This is A Very Vexing Murder by Lucy Andrew, which is the first in the Harriet Smith Investigates series. So this is a novel that is a crime retelling of Emma, and in it Emma is sort of flipped on its head in lots of different ways, and we are following the character of Harriet Smith. And Harriet Smith in the novel Emma is a very sort of like naive, innocent young woman who sort of looks up to Emma in all things, and in this novel she is a con woman who has been sent to Highbury on a mission, and she goes about pretending to be a very different kind of person from the kind of person that she is. I'm trying not to say too much about the premise because I feel like Emma is a book that is very easily spoiled, but there's something about A Very Vexing Murder that works really wonderfully in collaboration with Emma, because Emma is a novel where Emma as a central character doesn't always understand everything around her and doesn't always see things clearly and doesn't always understand the people around her, and therefore to have a book in which there is this whole like other plot going on in the background of Emma that Emma knows nothing about, like it just works really well and it's very, very fun. And I also especially enjoyed the dynamic between Harriet Smith and Robert Martin. In the novel Emma, Robert Martin is a love interest for Harriet Smith. In this novel, they are good friends, but in a complicated way where Harriet Smith keeps like pulling Martin into all of her schemes, and he really doesn't want to be involved in any of her schemes and just wants to be left alone to write his book. And it's just very, very funny. Their dynamic was such a highlight of this book. Overall, this is just very, very good fun, and I had a lovely, lovely time with it indeed. So there we go. And then I also read a book that was not exactly a Jane Austen retelling, but it featured Jane Austen as a character. That was 6 Weeks by the Sea by Paula Byrne. This is a novel that takes a sort of Austen family myth, this idea that Jane Austen once fell in love at the seaside, and puts that into a novel. We're following Jane Austen at the seaside for 6 weeks and a man she meets there. I was interested going into this because I have really loved Paula Byrne's non-fiction about Jane Austen, and overall I do have slightly mixed feelings about this. It is a very short book. It's sort of 200 pages, but the text is quite big, and I feel like it probably should have been a longer book. I really liked the central love story. I thought that was done very well, and there were some moments of it that were really moving, but I feel like the subplots in it were not developed as much as they could have been and kind of needed to be. I feel like this book was trying to do slightly too much for the short length of it. And I think especially because those two subplots are sort of looking at social issues at this point in time, I feel like they really needed a bit more space and a bit more depth. So, like I said, the central plot worked very well for me, but I feel like this book was just a bit too short for what it was trying to do. Then I also read a book set in the Regency period, but not directly connected to Jane Austen, and that was How to Lose a Lord in 10 Days by Sophie Irwin, which was just an utter delight in every single way. Oh, it's just so wonderful. I love a romance novel, but what I love more than a romance novel is a rom-com, and this is a proper rom-com. It is very, very funny. It is very romantic. The love story is great, but also it's just absolutely hilarious. So this is a book set in the Regency period, and it's about a young woman called Lydia. And at the very beginning of the novel, she receives a proposal from a man who is heir to a dukedom, and her aunt and uncle basically pressure her into saying yes. She doesn't feel that she has any other option. So she says yes, but she really doesn't want to marry him because she wants to marry someone she's in love with. She wants to fall in love. She is a romantic at heart, but she is now stuck engaged to this man, and she knows her aunt and uncle will be furious if she breaks off the engagement. So she decides to behave in such a way as to make him jilt her. And she is invited to his cousin's house for a house party for 10 days. And in those 10 days, during which their engagement is going to be kept secret, she tries very, very hard to make him break off the engagement with her. And that all leads to just absolute hilarity. It's very, very, very funny indeed, but also like lovely and charming and heartfelt, and there's some really like interesting complex themes underneath the surface as well. I feel like Sophie Irwin is a great writer for writing Regency historical fiction that is really, really fun and really charming, but also like does look at the serious social issues of that time. And I just loved it. I just had such a good time with this one. It was just an utter delight in every way. So I highly, highly recommend How to Lose a Lord in 10 Days. In general, I very much recommend Sophie Irwin's books. I think they're really, really good fun. And this was, yeah, just an absolute delight to read. Then I also got through some non-fiction in Jane Austen July. Well, the first one is not solely non-fiction, but I guess it is majority non-fiction. I finally read Encounters with Jane Austen, celebrating 250 years. This is an anthology of various things related to Jane Austen. So there are short stories and poetry and essays and interviews, just like a big lovely medley of Jane Austen related things. This has been on my shelf since last year when it came out, because I have an essay in here about sort of like coming to love Jane Austen's books over time, and I just hadn't got around to reading everyone else's contributions, so it was really, really nice to read this at the beginning of July, and I enjoyed it a lot. Very fun read. And I also read Courting Disaster by Zoe McGee, which is a work of literary criticism. The subtitle of this is Reading Between the Lines of the Regency novel, and this is a really fascinating non-fiction work that is basically about how 18th century and early 19th century literature looks at issues of sexual consent. So it's a really tough read. Like, I think that's worth knowing. There's some really difficult subject matter in here, but it is a really important read and a really, really interesting one. This book examines late 18th and early 19th century literature and how books from that time look at issues of sexual consent, sometimes very, very much directly, and sometimes through looking at the extent to which women do and don't have power within courtship and marriage. And it's a really, really fascinating work of non-fiction. As I said, quite a tough read, but also just brilliant. Like, this is just some of the best literary criticism I've ever read, I think. So I would highly recommend this. Really fantastic work. Like I said, difficult read, but well worth your time. Then finally, I also read Queer Georgians by Anthony Delaney. I did actually finish this off at the beginning of August, but as it was a Jane Austen July read, I thought I would mention it in this wrap-up anyway. This was a really interesting non-fiction book that looks at the lives of queer Georgians. The subtitle is A Hidden History of Lovers, Lawbreakers and Homemakers. Anthony Delaney basically goes through several case studies of people from the Georgian period who were queer and looks at their lives through an examination of the primary source material that we have. So there are several figures sort of mentioned in here, some of which you may have heard of. There's the ladies of Llangollen, I never know how to say that word, the Chevalier Dion, Anne Lister, Lord Harvey, Horace Walpole, and various other figures. I found this a really, really interesting read, very, very detailed with a lot of really interesting primary source material, a tough read in places, but also a hopeful history in other places, and a really powerful read. I don't know how I feel about the chapter on Anne Lister. I feel like my reading of Anne Lister as a person is not quite the same as his. But I also feel like he does have a lot of primary source material to back up his negative view of Anne Lister. But also, having read a lot of her diaries, I just feel slightly emotionally attached to her, and like I know her really well. I don't know. So yeah, anyway, but in general, really good book. Would highly recommend it. Well worth a read. So that's everything that I read for Jane Austen July. I then did also watch a few things for Jane Austen July. So I rewatched the film Love and Friendship, which is an adaptation of Lady Susan, which I always really, really enjoy. I also finished off watching The Other Bennet Sister, the mini-series, which I made a video about with Nick, which I'll leave linked down below. And I also watched Behind Closed Doors, the Lucy Worsley documentary. I made a video about that with Marissa, so that'll be linked down below, and I enjoyed all of that. And overall, I'm pretty pleased with what I got through in Jane Austen July. There were two books I was hoping to get to that I didn't manage to get to, one of which was Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen by Rory Muir, and the other one was The Elopement by Jill Hornby. I'm sad I didn't get round to them in Jane Austen July, but I'm sure I will read them later in the year and or for next Jane Austen July. And overall, I did get through sort of more than I was expecting to, so I'm very pleased with that. And then I also read two things in July that were nothing to do with Jane Austen July, randomly, as you do. One thing that I read was The Seven Dials Mystery by Agatha Christie, which Nick and I listened to together on audiobook. We have been listening to the Poirot books in order, but we took a brief pause to listen to some Superintendent Battle books. I had read The Seven Dials Mystery before, but not for quite a long time, and we listened to that together, and it's quite good. It's not the best Agatha Christie, and in general I like her like proper murder mysteries more than her like adventure novels, but I do think it's quite fun, and I think there are some really fun characters in it. I really like Superintendent Battle as a character, and I do like Lady Eileen Bundle. I think she's really fun too, but I do feel like the plot is slightly ridiculous, which is kind of the point, but still. Seven Dials Mystery begins with a country house party, and someone ends up found dead in the morning with clock faces lined up on his bedside table, and his death may or may not have a connection to a secretive London gang, and everything kind of goes on from there. Like I said, not my favourite Agatha Christie, but a fun listen. Then I also read one poetry collection in July, Gravity Archives by Andrew Motion, which I didn't really gel with, and I feel like I have very little to say about. This just wasn't really quite for me. There were a few poems towards the end of the collection that I did get a bit more out of, but a lot of them just, yeah, didn't really gel with me. I feel like whenever I read a novel, I always get something out of it. There are novels that I love and there are novels that I quite like, but I feel like it's very rare that I read a novel and it gives me nothing, whereas I feel like poetry is much more hit and miss for me, and there are poetry collections that I absolutely love, but there's also some poetry collections that just, you know, sort of go over my head or past my shoulder or whatever, and I don't really get much out of them, and I feel like this is one of those, so I don't have very much to say about that. That is everything that I read in July. Do please let me know what you read in July. Did you have a good Jane Austen July? If you are participating, I would love to know. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.